إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا. ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له عليه توكلنا إليه أنبنا إليه المصير. خصنا بخير كتاب أنزل وخير نبي أرسل وخير منهاج شرع. فقال عز من قال اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وصفيه من خلقه وخليله بلغ الرسالة وأدى الأمانة وجاهد في الله حق جهاده حتى أتاه اليقين عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم. اللهم أحينا على ملته واحشرنا مع زمرته إنك على كل شيء قدير. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. Or you who believe, fear Allah as he should be feared and are not accepted as Muslims. أما بعد فإن خير الكلام كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل بدعة ضلالة. Truly the best of the words is the book of Allah and the best of the guidance is the guidance of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, and the worst of the matters are the false innovation in the religion. Any such thing is a misguidance. If I can ask my brothers to come forward, there's plenty of space inshallah. For those that come later, it's a little really hot outside. When we stand up, the lines will be a little closer, so there'll be plenty of space inshallah. My khutbah today, my brothers and sisters, are about things that are not important, things that are not significant, things that are of secondary nature, but yet how these things sometimes control our life, and they will harm us actually from what we do not expect it to happen. And it happens in different ways. So if I were to ask, for example, a person, if he would drink a cup of poison, everybody will say no. But yet, at the same time, we expose ourselves to certain harmful things in the environment or eating something contaminated, and with time, some poison will be accumulated enough to be as effective or as harmful as that initial cup that I talked about. Now, of course, this is not about the khutbah about the environment, but the principle, actually, with what I'm trying to convey in here, is that sometimes we have enough awareness to keep us away from the big sins, from the big problems. But sometimes our thinking of some of the minor things as being insignificant will lead us to war or to fall into the same kind of danger. That's why the Prophet ﷺ warned us against that. And into saying that, the shaitan will use that as a gate into achieving the bigger harm to his ummah. So when he said ﷺ, يا أيها الناس, he says, أيها الناس إن الشيطان قد يئس أن يعبد في أرضكم هذه أبدا ولكنه إن يطع فيما سوى ذلك فقد رضي به مما تحقرون من أعمالكم فاحذروه على دينكم. That the Prophet says that the shaitan, he has given up on you worshipping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that land, and he was referring to the Arabian Peninsula. So he says that shaitan has given up on that happening. However, he will be happy, he will be satisfied if you do anything else short of that. Because, and the Prophet says that this will be the way to destruction. These small things, when we think insignificant of them, but yet accumulated through time, or put together, they would result in the same harmful effect as would be otherwise. So if I were to ask anyone, for example, would you steal a certain sum of money? Everybody will say, I would never do that. But yet sometimes our negligence at work, or our using certain work-related materials for personal purposes, anyway, is a form of stealing, and with time, they may add up to that same sum of money that I refused to steal in the beginning. By thinking insignificant of those small things, they would add up, and that will be a way to destruction without us actually feeling that. And again, that's what the Prophet ﷺ warned against. That's what they said. Sa'ad ibn Junada, he says, after the Muslims returned from the Battle of Hunayn, the Prophet ﷺ asked them that go and collect whatever you could bring. So he started bringing pieces of bone, pieces of wood, pieces of straw, until there was a big heap in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And he says, أَتَرَوْنَ هَذَا? Do you see this? And he says, فَكَذَلِكَ تَجْتَمِعُ الذُّنُوبُ عَلَى الرَّجُلِ مِنْكُمْ كما جمعتم هذه فليتق الله رجل فلا يذنب صغيرة ولا كبيرة فأنها محصاة عليه. He said, did you see these things, this big heap that's just in front of me now? And then so are the sins. They will add up from small things you do not think much of, a piece of bone, a piece of straw, until eventually they make up a big heap. And he said, beware of that, because all of that actually is counted before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So things that we may not think much of will add up until they become actually something really very significant. We feel enough awareness to avoid the big, but sometimes we neglect the small, even though they can be as destructive as the big. There was an example given by somebody. He says a tree that has survived hundreds of years and maybe was hit by lightning once or twice and lived through the biggest of storms may be attacked by small insects that will start boring actually inside until eventually it will be flattened down. But that's how things happen. The Prophet ﷺ said that those big heaps will start from small pebbles that we may not think, we may not have enough awareness to watch these things, but yet that will bring the destruction. And as they say in Arabic, مُعظم النار من مستصغر الشرر, that the biggest of fires come or start from small actually lighting. Now these insignificancies sometimes control us in a different way. You know, when it comes to our actions, we don't think much of what we do, so this will bring a big harmful effect. Sometimes we go to the other extreme, and that normally happens when we deal with others, is that we magnify the small things instead of actually putting them where they belong. So whenever I'm doing something that is not that important, I don't think much of it, and I don't like others to think much of it. But when I'm dealing with the others, I do exactly the opposite. I magnify that which is small, and in a way it becomes really what defines that person in front of me. So a person may be really a good, nice person, but if I see him doing something small, that's all what I remember about him. That's all what I could think of him, is really this small things. What about everything else that we did? And subhanAllah, sometimes unfortunately we do that even when we deal with some great scholars or great personalities. Like for example, you hear people criticizing this scholar or that, oh, Shaykh al-Qaradawi, may Allah reward him, you know, the greatest scholar. Some people will say, well, how could he say this and how could he say that? And to us, we make a big crossing mark on him, because why? He did or he said something that we don't agree with, and probably we did not actually understand what he was saying. And because of that, in a way, we dismiss him and we forget everything else good that he did. And the same thing was done, by the way, with other scholars. People do it all the time. SubhanAllah, even about Ibn Taymiyyah, may Allah be pleased with him. And Imam al-Dhahabi said something. He said about Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, وَلَقَدْ انْفَرَدَ بِفَتَاوَ النِّيلَ مِنْ عِرْضِهِ لِأَجْلِهَا وَهِيَ مَغْمُورَةٌ فِي بَحْرِ حَسَنَاتِهِ. He says he had certain fatwas that were unique to him. Al-Dhahabi was saying about Ibn Taymiyyah, that Ibn Taymiyyah said certain fatwas that were unique to him, and because of these fatwas, people insulted Ibn Taymiyyah in his honor. And he said, and these, if they were mistakes, they are insignificant compared to the oceans of good deeds that he has done. But sometimes we focus on the small things and we forget the big pictures. And subhanAllah, you can say that this attitude actually is the biggest cause of family problems more than anything else. Husband and wife, you know, that's what the Prophet ﷺ said about the woman, some women. They said that يُحْسِنُ إِلَيْهَا الدَّهْرِ, that he will treat his wife all of his life, and if she sees any shortcoming from him, she will tell him مَا رَأَيْتُ مِنْكَ خَيْرًا قَطْ, that I have not seen anything actually good from you. Now this, some brothers are smiling. Actually, this is not meant to be a joke. This is something alarming, wallahi, subhanallah, because actually earlier in this hadith, the Prophet said that this is the biggest actually path to hellfire for the women. And of course for the men, or for, of course, if they do it as well. He says, بِكُفْرِهِنْ, they says, يَكْفُرْنَ اللَّهِ, and the Prophet says, يَكْفُرْنَ الْعَشِيرِ. And he mentioned the rest of the hadith, alayhi salatu wassalam. That sometimes we forget everything good about that person, and we focus only on the small things. What about everything else? Everything else that was done. And subhanAllah, Allah Himself says in the Quran, إِنَّ الْحَسَنَاتِ يُذْهِبْنَ السَّيِّئَاتِ. The good deeds erase the bad deeds. The opposite is not true. Bad deeds do not erase the good deeds. That's why, subhanAllah, when dealing with those secondary matters, you don't want to forget the bigger picture. You don't want to actually think very insignificant of those small things which would lead to our destruction, or you don't want to actually magnify it when dealing with the others. Oh, she said this to me, or he said that to me. And like I said, especially it happens in families, and not just husband and wife, you know, even the bigger family, especially in-laws and things of that category, is that she doesn't like this, he doesn't like that, she meant to say this, and we start getting into intentions, and we focus on the small things as if these small things is really what define the individual. So this brother become the brother who said this. Everything else is forgotten about the brother. Or this is my cousin or my nephew or my in-law who said that or who did this. That's it. That's all there is about that person. This is not fair. This is not fair. This is not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam is teaching us. When the Prophet says that, when she said to her husband that I have not seen anything good from you, it doesn't mean that, well, that's what the Prophet says, I cannot help it, that's the way I am. No, no. The Prophet mentioned that to warn us against it. To say that this is one of the biggest mistakes, biggest sins, for us to limit the person into something that insignificant. And subhanAllah, there's a story at the time of the Prophet ﷺ to show us how to put things into perspective. There was a Sahabi who used to get drunk, and they would flog him, punish him, because of being drunk, and then after that he goes back to drinking, and they would punish him again, and he goes back and he drinks again, and they will bring him back and they will punish him. And one of the Sahaba said, I think his name is Abdullah, and he had a strange sense of humor. The Prophet used to like him. So this person that kept getting flogged, punished, the other said about him, look at him, how many times do we have to keep bringing him back? May Allah curse him. He never learns. And the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تسبوا أخاكم, do not curse your brother. And he said, إنه يحب الله ورسوله, he loves Allah and His Messenger. How can you ignore that? No matter what else he does, how could you ignore the fact that he loves Allah and His Messenger? That's why he said, do not define him by, even though that's a big thing. He's been continuously drinking and drinking and drinking, much bigger than anything that we deal with. But yet the Prophet ﷺ said, in a way, do not limit him to that. He loves Allah and His Messenger. And another story, something similar to that, the Prophet says, سَتَنْهَاهُ صَلَاتُهُ إِنْشَاءَ and it did. That's why we do not just limit, subhanAllah, when dealing with each other's, into the shortcomings, as if this is all we see. Subhanallah, the Prophet mentioned a beautiful example. You know how sometimes, also the way we do it, a person may listen to a lecture or a lesson that has really good meanings. And all we see is that, well, he said this, he wasn't supposed to say it that way. You forgot everything else. Subhanallah, that's what the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned about people that do that go listen to a nice speech or a nice message, and all they pick is the small things. The Prophet said, it's like somebody, this is the example of the Prophet, like somebody who was told by a shepherd to go and pick the nicest sheep that he has, and that man goes and picks the dog of the flock instead of picking the sheep. This is the example the Prophet gave us, ﷺ, that do not limit or focus only on the negative things, but there are much more actually into other people than to limit them, even if they're committing a sin, even if they're drinking, even if they're doing the biggest sin, but there's something bigger about them. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم فاستغفروه الغفور الرحيم. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Alhamdulillah, Ramadan is approaching very soon. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us reach Ramadan, and to help us inshallah worship Him the way we should, and to accept from us at the end inshallah. But sometimes an issue similar to that comes up in the beginning of the month, and of course if we miss it, we don't miss the end of the month. That in the beginning of the month, how should we start the month? Calculation, citing and all of that, and we start arguing with that, and like I said, we forget everything else about our brothers except that particular thing, is that he's going by calculation, he's going by citing, as if this is a sin. And fiqh wise, by the way, there's support for both, and I can argue one way or the other. That's why, subhanallah, and we forget something very important, an important hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that he says, الصوم إذا صام الناس والفطر إذا أفطروا. Another hadith, صومكم يوم تصومون صومكم يوم تصوم وفطركم يوم تفطرون وأضحاكم يوم تضحون. So he says that fasting is with the people when people fast. This is the important thing. That's why here the scholars, they said that it is better to be united around a weak opinion than to be divided among a weak and strong opinion. Because sometimes we think, well, this is a stronger opinion. Yes, but there's something more important in there, which is the unity. That's why it is more important to be united in following the weaker opinion than to be divided between the weaker and the stronger opinion. Because Ramadan has this social aspect and unity aspect to it. That's why, subhanAllah, like I said, sometimes the beginning of the month, everything goes smooth, but however, at the end, it comes back to us. Sometimes we miss opportunity to do good things, but whenever we have an opportunity for a problem, we don't miss it. It's always there for us, unfortunately. But subhanAllah, hopefully we should try to work on increasing the awareness actually, of ourselves first, and to be aware that Islam is a religion of a community, not just of individuals. So I do not deal with these issues by myself, irrespective of how the others. But everything actually has to do, or has to do with the others, and sometimes the scholar may favor one opinion over another, just on the basis that this will be of more benefit to other people than to the person actually himself. That's why we don't want to forget that, inshallah, and to keep things into perspective, and not to turn a month of mercy into a month of conflict and an occasion for that. And of course, through the month of Sha'ban, the Prophet ﷺ, Aisha said about him in an authentic hadith that the Prophet ﷺ never fasted a complete month like he did except the month of Ramadan, and he never fasted in any other month as much as he did in the month of Sha'ban. That's why it's a sunnah to fast as much as possible in the month of Sha'ban. And hopefully it will get the body ready and the spirit and the heart ready for the great event, which is the month of Ramadan. But however, in another hadith by Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تقدموا رمضان بصيام يوم أو يومين إلا من كان يصوم صوما, that do not precede the month of Ramadan by fasting 1 or 2 days, except a person who was already fasting for another reason. That's why it is not encouraged to fast the last 2 days of Sha'ban before Ramadan, unless the person is already making up some fasting that he has missed, or if the person, for example, is fasting Mondays and Thursdays, and that happened to be the day before Ramadan, it is permissible. But to fast it for that reason by themselves, it is not encouraged. And also, if the person fasts the last day of Sha'ban just to be on the safe side, then that is prohibited. It is haram, based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, فَإِنْ غُمَّ عَلَيْكُمْ فَقْدِرُوا لَهُ, that if you're not certain, then actually you complete the 30 days actually of Sha'ban and not get into Ramadan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to help us reach Sha'ban, to help us complete Sha'ban and help us reach Ramadan. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to help us worship Him the way we should and to accept from us at the end. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us recognize the truth and help us follow it, and to help us recognize the falsehood and help us avoid it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make the best of our deeds, the last ones that we do, and the best of our days, the day that we shall meet Him. And Allah أمرنا بأمر عميم بدأ بنفسه وثنى بملائكة قدسه فقال ولم يزل قائلا عليما حكيما أن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك اللهم على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين واعلي بفضلك كلمتي الحق والدين. اللهم من أراد بالمسلمين خيرا فوفقه إلى كل خير ومن أراد بهم شرا فخذه أخذ عزيز مقتدر. اللهم يا واصل المنقطعين أوصلنا إليك. اللهم ولا تخزنا يوم العرض عليك. اللهم وارزقنا لذة النظر إلى وجهك الكريم. اللهم اغفر للمسلمين والمسلمات المؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات والحمد لله رب العالمين وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر.